Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Tim Pratt. I am the chair of the Environmental Quality Committee, and it's my pleasure to host you this evening for our speaker series. Tonight's presentation, Helping People Help Bees. And so one of the things, of course, that we'll talk about is plantings and what you can put in your yard, which is a great tie-in to, or a promotion, I should say, for the other big event that we do every year, which is the Green Community Awards. So you can qualify for Green Community Awards if you do something in terms of water quality or water quantity conservation, or and part of that is through planting of native plants or buffer strips, which can also be attract pollinators. And then the other category is energy efficiency. So we'll be looking for that application on the city's website in the next month or so. And despite the fact that we call it an award, it's really more of an exhibition rather than a competition, because we really want to show off the great things that people are doing here in Shoreview and inspire others or make them jealous with the little lawn sign that you get, so that they do something similar. And so we can spread that out across the city. So we'll get you some hints tonight of some of the things that you could do to become a Green Community Award winner through the presentation tonight. You know, when we brainstorm what topics we want to have as part of the environmental speaker series, we try to find things that are kind of in the news and hot topics. And little did we know that the month that we would have the speaker on helping bees, that the folks at General Mills announced that they're going to take the little bee off of their Honey Nut Cheerios to remind people of the importance of bees and what would happen if they went away. And they also have a website where you can go and sign up, and they will send you free wildflower seeds that you can plant in your yard. So great timing on our part that we didn't know about, but thought I'd do a little promotion for that. Our speaker tonight is Anna Heck, and she is a beekeeper and project coordinator and grant writer with the Bee Squad at the University of Minnesota. Anna learned how to keep bees in Nicaragua while apprenticing on an organic farm and working with a women's beekeeping cooperative. She joined the University of Minnesota Bee Squad in 2014, where she enjoys working with bees, beekeepers, and the public. Anna holds a BA in philosophy and Spanish with minors in applied ethics and justice and peace studies from Creighton University and a master's degree in public policy from the University of Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming Anna Heck.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm excited to talk tonight about bees. All right, let me get set up here. All right. So this photo here was taken of our new bee and pollinator research lab. I don't know if some of you heard, but recently we got this moved into a new bee lab. Our grand opening was last October, and this is a really awesome thing to happen to us, because before the bee lab was spread out around campus, we didn't have very good place. We didn't have enough space to work, and we weren't all in the same place, so there wasn't as much collaboration as there is now. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking about bees and who bees are, what's going on with bees, why they aren't thriving, and then about our research and programs at the University of Minnesota and how you can help bees. All right, so I like to start with this slide. Who can tell me which bee? So we'll do a show of hands. Who thinks that the photo on the left is a bee? Who thinks the photo on the right is a bee? Oh, you all are experts already. Good. So a lot of times it's really easy for people to confuse bees and wasps. There's a lot of differences between them. One of the most obvious differences to me is that wasps are more shiny and bees are hairy. The hairiness of the bees is what allows them to be such good pollinators, because they're carrying around pollen on those hairs. Wasps do a little bit of pollination, just kind of more by accident, but they're not nearly as efficient at pollinating as our bees are. But a lot of times people will tell me, oh, I got stung by a bee, and most of the time it's going to be a wasp. Wasps are a bigger nuisance to people in Minnesota than bees are. So look at that, you got it right. So one of the resources on our website at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab is information on distinguishing bees versus wasps. It's really common for us in late summer to get a lot of calls about people wanting bee removal because they think there's bees that are in a problematic area of their yard, and more often than not, it's paper wasps or yellow jackets. So now we're going to focus on bees in particular. I wanted to point out that there are thousands of different species of bees. So in the United States, we have over 3,000 different species, and honeybees are just one of those species. Bumblebees are 19 of those species. So there are a lot of bees that don't really get any recognition or attention. Lots of different species, and a lot of species that we have a lot more learning to do. So this is a resource also on our website that shows the different families of bees and how many species are in each family. All right, so I'm sure, General Mills is doing a great job of helping get this point across, but I'm sure you've heard that our food system is pretty dependent on animal pollination. We know that about 1 out of every 3 bites of food benefits from animal pollination. So they're doing us a huge service. Oh, I'm gonna need to go. So a while ago, Whole Foods helped show the public what our food choices would look like with and without bee pollination. So the top photo is their normal Whole Foods spread, and then the bottom photo, they took out everything that benefits from bee pollination. So we say we're not really in danger right now of our grocery stores looking quite like the photo on the bottom, but we are concerned that as it's harder and harder for bees to thrive, our food choices are going to, the cost could increase for our groceries and those foods. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about honeybees in particular. Honeybees are not native to the United States. The honeybees we have here from Europe, they are really great pollinators because they live in colonies. They're social insects, and so in the peak of the summer, there can be 50,000 or more bees in a colony. So especially if you're, for pollination services, honeybees are great because we're able to have a lot of bees all in one place and then move them around as pollination services are needed. Yes?
Do you have any idea, or is there a number available as to what the pollination would be if we didn't have European honeybees?
So the question was, what would pollination look like without European honeybees? And it would look close to the photo on the bottom. We know that a lot of our native pollinators and bumblebees are good pollinators. Sometimes they're even better at pollinating than honeybees, but the reason that makes them not quite as good for food production is that most wild bee species or native bee species are solitary. So you'll have one living in the ground. You can't really move them around and bring them anywhere, and even if you do, you might bring a few, but with honeybees, a whole colony has thousands and thousands of workers who will be pollinating. Good question. So here we have what a honeybee hive looks like. So in the bottom left corner, you can see those are frames. We have boxes with bees, and then we have removable frames, and that's what allows us as beekeepers to take really good care of our bees, is to be able to inspect them and then monitor and manage them. And honeybees are hoarders. They need honey to survive the winter. Right now, our bees are clustering. They just get really close to each other and use their flight muscles to shake, and then that's how they generate heat, and they do that all winter long. It sounds kind of miserable to me, but they do just fine in cold weather, but they do need honey as their food source over the winter. So in the summer, they're going to flowers, finding nectar, bringing it back, converting it to honey, and they don't really ever think about I guess we have enough now, let's just take a break and relax. They'll just keep going and going and going as long as there's nectar available. So that's what allows us as humans to benefit from their honey, because the healthy bees will produce extra honey. So honeybee colonies are So commercial beekeepers move honeybee colonies around the United States. So just a few weeks ago in February, beekeepers were in California for the almond pollination. Almonds are in California are completely reliant on honeybees for pollination. And that's the biggest almond production in the world. 90% of commercial bee colonies, so it's between 1 and 2 million colonies are in California at the same time for these pollination services. And so after that, the bees are moved to different places depending on the beekeeper. So they're moved to places where the beekeeper will get paid for pollination services, or where beekeepers will be able to make a honey production. Minnesota normally ranks in the top 5 states for honey production. Montana, the Dakotas, and Minnesota have a lot of nectar in the late summer, early fall. That's really good for beekeepers. Yes?
I'm told that almond honey is inedible. Do you know what they do with it?
So the question was that you heard that honey or almond honey is inedible. When the bees are in California for the almond blossom, they're looking for pollen, or they're pollinating and they're eating pollen, not nectar. So at that time when they're there isn't any nectar to make honey from. But the almond growers rely on the bee pollination. So 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 the bees still need pollen, but it's a protein source for them that they don't convert into honey. All right, so here are the 3 different kinds of, casts of honeybees. On your left, you'll see the worker bee. Worker bees are female. In the middle is a drone. Drone bees are male. And then on the right, you see the queen. So you can see that she's a little bit longer than the other bees. The drones have the really big eyes. So queens can lay over 1,000 eggs in a day. That's pretty much their only role, is to lay eggs all day long, and especially in the time of year when they're laying. They'll slow down later in the summer or early fall. And the queens also give off a pheromone that lets the other bees in the colony know that her presence is there, that she's around. So if we take a queen out of a colony, the bees will notice in less than a day. There are drone bees. Drone bees make up about 10 to 20% of the bees in a colony during the summer. They're male bees, and their whole role is to mate with new queens from other colonies. So they'll go, when they're mature enough, they'll go fly around, try to find a virgin queen from another colony. If they succeed in mating, then they'll die within a few hours. And they actually get kicked out of the hive in the late summer because the reproduction period for bees is only spring and summer. It doesn't make sense for the bees to have a bunch of drones around who aren't doing any work in the hive and who are bigger and eat more food. So we actually see worker bees escorting the drone bees out at the end of the summer, which is kind of sad. And then we have our worker bees, and our worker bees do pretty much everything. When they're younger, they're doing a lot of cleaning around the hive and feeding the brood, so feeding the eggs, larvae, and pupae. They also do a lot of the construction of the wax comb, and when they're older, they'll fly a few miles for nectar and pollen, for forage, and they also are the ones that will defend the hive. So those are what I just said, the list of things that bees do, or worker bees do. And then this is what the brood looks like. So in the top left corner, you can see eggs. They're kind of like little teeny grains of rice. On the bottom, there's larvae, and they're sitting in that milky substance is their food, which is made of nectar and pollen. And then in the picture on the right, towards the right, you can see pupae. So those are the capped cells. So that's kind of like the cocoon phase for bee development. So a natural way that honeybee colonies reproduce themselves is through swarming. And swarming happens when, normally in the springtime is when it's most common. A queen who's made it through the winter will leave with a group of worker bees, and then they'll leave behind some queens that are developing, so some queens that are in the larval or pupal stages, and this swarm will go off to find a new home. And so it's the way that the colony is able to divide and reproduce itself. And so typically what the bees do is they'll kind of like find like a meeting spot close to the hive. And so that you'll see like you might see a swarm really close to a hive. And then once they're there, there'll be scout bees that will go off and try to look for a new home. Typically it's in a so like tree cavity would be really common, but they're cavity nesters. So they, in this part of the United States, so they would look for a cavity. And then once they found a suitable location, they would go and move into that new hive. So we don't have a lot of honeybees that survive well in the wild here, and in most parts in the United States, for the most part, honeybee colonies are managed, and that's the way that we are able to keep them alive is best by managing them. They have a harder time surviving in the wild right now. But if any of you see a swarm, first of all, it's super cool. Second of all, they're super gentle because bees will only really sting if they feel threatened, and they'll feel threatened if they're protecting their food, so their honey or pollen, or if they are protecting their brood, their eggs, larvae, or pupae, or if you kind of smash them. But other than that, if they're in a swarm, they have pretty much nothing to protect. They're not they're not emotionally invested in that tree branch right there. And so they're really gentle. So if you do see a swarm, the Minnesota Hobby Beekeepers Association has a great resource. They have a network of beekeepers who will go and remove a swarm, oftentimes for free, if you see one. All right, so I'm gonna go a little into why bees aren't thriving right now. So here is a map of the United States of the losses we had of honeybee colonies from 2014 to 2015. Beekeepers expect to lose some colonies each year. Acceptable rates are normally around 15%. Beekeepers are able to divide their colonies in the spring, so it's not the end of the world to lose some colonies, but what we've seen recently are really high losses and unsustainably high losses. So you'll see in Minnesota, we were at just over 50% of colonies that were lost. And backyard beekeepers tend to be newer beekeepers, and they tend to statistically, they lose many more colonies than our commercial beekeepers do. And so why are we losing so many colonies? So this is kind of an overview of the different things that are affecting our honeybees right now. So we have the varroa parasite, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and viruses and pathogens. And then we also have pesticides, which include insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and not enough flowers. So the varroa mites, we say, are the #1 threat to our honeybees right now. It's kind of looks like a tick. It's really large on the body of a honeybee. You can see in that picture on the left. So we say it would be like having like a rabbit or a mouse or like dinner plate on us. It would be really big. And the issue for honeybees is that especially our honeybees here aren't able to groom the mites off of themselves. And the mites feed on the honeybees, and then they carry viruses and other kinds of diseases, and then they're moving between honeybees in the colony, and they also move between colonies. So it's a huge issue that we have to deal with right now, is figuring out how we can continue to reduce the numbers of varroa mites in our colonies so that our bees can stay healthier. And here are a few more photos of varroa mites. Varroa mites are only on honeybees. They're a parasite. They completely rely on honeybees to reproduce, but they do reproduce in a cell when the bees are pupating. And the names of these viruses aren't important, but I just wanted to pull out a few different viruses that are harmful to bees that are transmitted by varroa. Another issue that we have is not enough flowers for bees, especially since in the last several decades, our landscape has transformed to have fewer flowers, especially in places where bees need them. So bees need a lot of nectar to make honey. They need about 75 to 100 pounds to survive the winter here in Minnesota. And they also need pollen. So honey is going to be their carbohydrate source. Pollen is their protein source. And they get it from several different sources, but that's also really important for their health and then also their rearing of brood. Pesticides are also a big issue. I know you can't read the name of every single pesticide on this list, but I promise the point of it is not so you can learn every single name right now, but just so you can see how many different pesticides we have and we're finding in pollen. Pollen holds pesticides a lot more than nectar does, and we find a lot of different pesticides in a lot of our pollen, and it's pretty troubling for bees. All right, so I'm going to transition now into talking a little bit about what we're doing at the University of Minnesota. Recently, we hired Dr. Dan Caravo, and he's an ecologist who works with native bees. So the University of Minnesota Bee Lab has a great reputation for years and years and years of working with honeybees and with beekeepers. And we know that our native bees are also suffering in some ways, maybe even more than our honeybees, but there's not quite as much historical data like we have for honeybees, and there's just so many different species that there's so much to learn. So as the new bee lab was built, it was really important to have a native bee expert in our lab, and Dan's doing an awesome job. And so I'll talk a little bit about his grad students in a little bit. Mike Golderish is a postdoc in our lab right now. He was the first person ever to create a honeybee cell line. So basically what this allows us to do is now that we have the cell line, he's able to look at how viruses and pathogens affect honeybees at the cellular level. It's way more technical than that, but that's the overview of what he's done. I'm sure a lot of you have noticed that most of our lawns, especially turf grass, don't have a lot of food and resources for bees. And so some people want to convert their yards into pure bee habitat and bee forage, and that's awesome. But we know there's a lot of people that still want to have a lawn, but also would like the idea of having some bee food in their lawn. So the University of Minnesota Bee Lab is working with the turf grass department to figure out how we can incorporate short flowers into our lawns that you can mow over, but still produce lots of nectar for bees. And so that's a project that Ian Lane started and is being continued by James. And so he's looking at different parks and trying to figure out which flowers are best. There's other students trying to figure out which grasses are best for these bee lawns, and then trying to figure out which bees are most likely to come to the different flowers that you'd use in a bee lawn. Morgan is a student in the lab who's looking a lot at pollen and native prairie flowers. And she's actually, so bees, when they find a source of pollen or nectar that's really good, they'll dance in order to tell the other bees where it is. So they'll waggle, they'll kind of move back and forth, and the amount of time that they're waggling in a cycle will tell the other bees how far away the source is, and the angle that they're waggling on the comb is relative to the angle of the sun that the bees should fly when they leave the hive. So they're like way better at directions than I probably will ever be, and they are able to communicate this with each other. So she actually, in her research, will videotape bees waggling in order to figure out where they are bringing their pollen from. Yes?
Native bees would obviously be acclimated to native flowers. But how well do European bees do with native flowers? I mean, why would we expect them to even forage from native flowers?
So the question was, native bees are obviously acclimated to native flowers, and then I think the rest of the question was on the microphone. So it depends. So honeybees are generalists, which means that they will forage on a lot of different flowers, not just on a few in particular. We have some bees that are very particular about which flowers they'll visit. Honeybees are generalists. So even though they didn't co-evolve with native flowers in the United States, they will visit several of them. There's several native plant varieties that are really great for honeybees, and I actually think that General Mills has sponsored research around that in the past, that question of which native flowers are good for honeybees and other bees. But honeybees also do really well on lots of non-native flowers, so that includes things like dandelions and Dutch white clover is not native, right? I always get this confused. But so they'll do well on different flowers that are also non-native, and sometimes those flowers are the best. So dandelion's an awesome source of pollen for honeybees because it's a really early source of pollen. So later in this, most of our native flowers aren't blooming quite that early. I know people don't like to hear that about dandelions, but maybe it makes you feel good if you have a bunch already. All right, did you have a question?
Yeah, how about native bees? Are they specialists on native flowers, or will they go to cultivated flowers?
It depends on the bee. Some are very specific. They tend to do well on native flowers, but some of them will visit non-native flowers as well. Oops. All right. This is a picture of, so the bottom left picture is of pollen grains. So this is going back to Morgan's research. And then in the bottom right, you can see bee waggling. So that's what I was just explaining about how bees communicate where their food sources are. Elaine Evans just finished her PhD at the University of Minnesota, and she does a lot of work on our native bee species and our bumblebees. And so she has spent years doing surveys in Minnesota and the Dakotas, learning about which kind of species we have here and keeping track and keeping good records, which is really important as we're trying to figure out how different bees are handling different environmental stresses, to have that data and that survey data. Alan is a new student in the lab, and he's looking at pollen in prairies. He's setting up his research for this summer, but basically looking at what prairies have to offer bees. Katie Lee is a student in the lab who works with commercial beekeepers. So she goes out and she'll help sample colonies, and so she takes representative samples from the colonies, evaluates colonies for different health issues and diseases, and sends some samples of bees to a lab to be examined, and then she reports that data back to commercial beekeepers. And she's also able to do it in a way that's anonymous so that beekeepers can kind of see where their bees rank without kind of feeling any kind of shame or anything because they're seeing all the data side by side, but it's reported anonymously. And so she now has years and years of data that not only her, but other people working in her position in different parts of the United States have collected. And so right now she's sorting through data for her PhD dissertation, and she'll be able to give that data back to the beekeepers, looking at big trends. So I work with the Bee Squad, and we're a group of people that does a lot of extension and education and outreach for the lab. So we have several different programs. These are undergraduates, except for my boss is the one next to the guy in the bee costume, but we needed her there for size reference. And we're supported, we have several different funding sources, from grants to private donations to institutional support. But we try to offer a lot of support to backyard beekeepers. It's really hard right now for backyard beekeepers to keep their bees alive, especially because of what's going on with mites and viruses and pathogens. So we'll go out to work with beekeepers if they have a specific question, or on campus we have hands-on beekeeping classes where beekeepers can come and work on our colonies and kind of then have a point of reference to know like what healthy looks like and kind of have a point of comparison for their own honeybees. We have a program where different families, organizations, and businesses pay us to take care of honeybee colonies on their property. And so this has been a great way for us to see health trends over time, and then also for us to have to do outreach and education with the Twin Cities metro area. We work with artists because it turns out artists are able to tell the story about what's going on with bees in lots of different creative ways. We also have a training program for veterans. And then we have several different community outreach programs where we're working with beekeepers and training people to do outreach. And we have a few programs also to increase habitat. And I don't know if you can see in the bottom left photo, but we work with a farmer, and we were designing these plots of land, and he designed them so that they're hexagons. I don't know if you can see, but they're 1 acre hexagon plots that we designed, and that's at a farm out in Osceola, Wisconsin. And they're used for creating more food for bees, but then also for research purposes, because we're able to manipulate them, and especially Morgan's research around pollen is done out there. Oh, and I also want to mention the TOP campaign as a Facebook campaign. So we're encouraging people to plant for bees and then to, share it on Facebook. And so if you're interested in looking that up, that would be a great place to get involved. It's like the perfect time of year to start thinking about planting for bees. Yes?
I have to ask, is a bee veteran a person who's raised bees, or is it a veteran, military veteran who likes bees?
Thanks for the clarification. So the Bee Veterans Sorry, I don't know where that was coming from. So, great question. The Bee Veterans Program is for veterans of foreign war who have come back. We work with a veteran, and he had this idea that some people might see beekeeping as a therapeutic activity, or at least a valuable extracurricular activity. So he funded us to start doing just like in-hive demonstrations with veterans, and then also some trainings with veterans. Yeah.
Are trees sources of pollen or nectar for bees?
Yeah, are trees sources of pollen or nectar for bees? Yes, so there are trees that are really great sources. Basswood is a great nectar source here in Minnesota. And then the other thing that's really valuable about trees is that bees collect propolis. I don't have anything in this presentation about propolis, but propolis is tree resins. And so bees will go and collect tree resins kind of the way they do with pollen. They'll pack it on their back legs, bring it back to the hive, and then they'll use it to seal up the hive. And so for years, it's just kind of like this annoying sticky substance for beekeepers because, tree resins, they get on you and then it's hard to get them off. But what we've learned is that they have, especially with Marla Spivak's research, is that there's a lot. Propolis is really valuable to the health of the colony. It has different antimicrobial properties, and so the University of Minnesota has done research looking at how propolis benefits their immune system, and there's projects going on right now about that. And then also looking at how we can increase propolis in a hive, because when bees have their hive in a tree cavity, it's really rough and uneven, so bees will just throw lots of propolis on it to smooth it out and seal those cracks. And when we put bees in hive bodies in those boxes, they're really smooth already, so the bees don't put as much propolis on them. Typically, it depends on different factors as to which hives have more propolis, but that's a really valuable source of propolis. So I know a lot of the propolis is coming from cottonwood, but there's a lot of different trees that produce propolis. All right, so how you can help bees. So bees need a lot of nectar and pollen. So they'll visit about 2 million flowers to make a pound of honey. A worker bee in her lifetime will produce about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. So I don't know if I always think about that anytime I have a little honey dripping off my jar. I always feel like I should eat it because I don't want it to be in vain. And then, as I said earlier, honeybees need about 75 to 100 pounds in Minnesota to survive the winter. So it's a lot of honey. And so really planting flowers is the best thing that you can do for bees. It's also really important to, avoid the unnecessary use of pesticides. We're learning more and more that for honeybee colonies, it's every once in a while we'll hear about an acute pesticide kill, meaning that bees are exposed to a honeybee colony is exposed to a lot of pesticides all at once, and it will kill them. And those are pretty rare, but we know happens a lot more frequently is that honeybees are introduced to pesticides. Maybe the older foragers will die. It shortens their lifespan. It weakens their immune system, and when they already have varroa mites and pathogens, it affects their overall health. So even if they're not exposed to enough pesticides to die overnight, this continual exposure to pesticides really has an effect on the colony as a whole and its ability to thrive. And the other thing is that for native bees, a lot of times, so when honeybees are feeding the brood, so remember that milky substance in the cells, is the worker bees have processed that through a gland, so there's some detoxification that's happened of the pollen when it's being fed to the brood. But when native bees that are solitary are fed pollen, they're just fed a ball of pollen, so there's not the same detoxification process that happens. So we still need a lot more research to understand exactly how our native bees are being affected by pesticides. We have some data on bumblebees and some other species, but there's so many species and there's a lot more to learn, and there's a lot to be concerned about. Yes?
I used to work for the pollution control agency in St. Paul, and we were studying malformed frogs. And we had zero luck getting people interested in controlling pesticides. How are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough thing. I think that there are a lot of people, there are a lot of people who are really concerned about bees and have heard some of what's going on and realize how important bees are for our ecosystem and our food system. But it is challenging, and it's a different discussion, urban versus rural, but a lot of times in urban areas, most of the pesticide use is cosmetic. So it's mostly because people want their yards to look a certain way. And a lot of the time, urban homeowners who are applying pesticides aren't trained in pesticide application. And there's not enough. I think there's a lot of people that don't even realize what they're buying and how harmful it can be to bees. So it's definitely something that we talk about a lot and we're working on, and there's people that have signs in their lawn that are showing that they're not using pesticides, but there's a lot of social norms about lawns, and it's tough at times, yeah. All right, so if you're wondering what to plant for Minnesota bees, we have a resource on our website that has a list of some of the flowers that are really great for bees. It's not exhaustive. There's other flowers that are also good for bees, but it's a really great place to start if you're thinking about planting for bees, which I hope all of you are. And so nesting habitat is also really important. So about 80% of our bee species are nested in the ground, and then about 20% nest in stems. So that means for ground nesting bees, it's really important for them just to have kind of bare ground, not necessarily like turf grass or something that's managed or mulch. And then for cavity nesting bees, it's really important to have stems. So they'll lay the queen will go in and lay eggs in the fall, and then those bees will emerge in the spring. So a lot of people I know like to cut back stems at the end of the fall, kind of cleaning up their yard, but there could be native bees living in there. So we're really trying to encourage people, if you want to cut things back, you can cut off the old flowers, but leave the stems so that we're leaving habitat for our stem nesting bees. Our bumblebees bumblebees are also social. They build their nests in undisturbed land, brush, or grass. So we also try to leave nesting habitat for them. And then I don't know if some of you have heard, but we, especially Elaine Evans' research and survey data has been showing that there's pretty significant declines in some bumblebee species. The rusty-patched bumblebee is being considered right now for the endangered species list. It was going to be considered, and then it's been pushed back recently, but we're working hard to let people know that it's a bee species that used to be really abundant, especially here in Minnesota, and now in a lot of places it's really difficult to find. And so its sudden decline is pretty concerning to us. So one thing that you all could do if you're interested is help us in our citizen science projects related to bumblebees. So all this takes is really kind of knowing what is a bumblebee and what isn't. We have some resources there, but for this survey, you take a photo, and then you get to upload your photo and identify it, and then an expert will go in and double check the way you ID'd your bumblebee. But this is a great way for us to kind of collect data around figuring out which bumble species are where, and then track that over time. And then there's another survey for rare bumblebees that's through the Minnesota Wild Bee Atlas program. So that's another opportunity as well. And on our website, we do have a guide to identifying bumblebees. And it takes a little bit of practice. When we do our bumblebee surveys, what we do is we go out with food containers, and we'll catch the bumblebees, we'll put them on ice so that they cool down, and then that'll get them to be still enough for us to identify them, and then we'll normally mark them with a dot of paint so we don't count them again later and release them. And once they warm up, they're good as new. So we do have a resource on identifying female and male bumblebees on our website, but probably some of the bumblebee species are pretty obvious, but then there's some that are really tricky to identify. But Elaine Evans does bumblebee surveys, and that's a great way to learn about bumblebee surveys and identification, and just a fun kind of family activity in the summer. So she doesn't have her bumblebee surveys scheduled for this upcoming summer quite yet, but she will, so you can check back with us if you're interested in participating. But she's been doing it for years, and it's been a really great way for us as a university to collect data, and also a good way for people to learn about bumblebees. Another cool resource that we have that's new is at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. They built a Pollinator Discovery Center. And so it has some awesome displays on bees and pollinators. A lot of it's really accessible to kids. They have great staff that are very knowledgeable about bees, so this is an awesome place to go and learn more. All right, and that was it. Any questions? Oh, yay, lots of questions, good.
Okay. How many, more or less, species of honeybees are there?
There's one species of honeybees. And so there are different subspecies of honeybees. So the honeybees, the Africanized honeybees or the killer honeybees that you hear about in South and Central America are different from our honeybees, but they're all the same species. It's just different subspecies.
So, sort of follow up, my father, when he kept bees and I would help him, he would often buy queens that were of some sort of sub-variety. So that's what he was doing?
Yeah, yep. So, in Minnesota, a lot of our bees are Italian or Carniole, and those are some of the subspecies that we have here. Yeah, good question. And I can't remember quite how many subspecies there are. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about control of that tick? My first thought is pesticides, but of course that won't work.
The varroa mite, yeah. So how do we control the varroa mite? There are several different things that we do to manage for them. So some of them, and there's a lot of research going on it. So we have some ideas of what we can do and some ideas of what might work in the future. We have a program where we encourage beekeepers to test for mites. We're able to test very easily, figure out how many mites we have per 100 bees, and then to report levels and figure out when an intervention is necessary. At the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, we do use organic treatments to kill the varroa mites. And so that's with large infestations, it's very difficult to drop the mite level without using those organic treatments. Other beekeepers have to use non-organic treatments, but at the University of Minnesota, we use organic. Yeah, there are a few other management strategies that ways we can manage our bees that can also reduce their level. Yes.
Hi. But I don't keep bees, but I have a rain garden in my front yard, which has blooming native plants that bloom at different times during the growing season. So we've had a lot of bees in the last 2 summers, which has been great to watch. Obviously, there's some biodiversity value there for what is otherwise a fairly sterile suburban lawn. But is that doing anything to help the food supply? I don't think bees go very far.
Right. So, I mean, I guess in the Twin Cities, if there's a lot of like community gardens or urban gardens, or even tomatoes in your backyard benefit from bumblebee pollination. So it's possible that the insects that you're seeing in your garden, your rain garden, are also benefiting your neighbor's vegetable gardens. But typically bees aren't flying more than a few miles. Yeah, honeybees will fly up to like 3 or 4 miles. I just heard research recently that a bumblebee flew 13 kilometers to return to its initial home, which is really crazy. But normally, they're not flying those kind of distances.
Is there like a recommended type of bumblebee for like starting beekeepers?
Recommended type of bumblebee for starting beekeepers? Okay, so our bumblebees, here, let me bring up a picture of them again. Okay, so you can see our bumblebees on the left. Typically, beekeepers work with honeybees, not bumblebees. So there are some growers and some people that work with bumblebees, but typically they're either using them for pollination, especially like different kinds of berries or tomatoes, or researchers. Beekeepers in general don't take care of bumblebees, and it's hard to take care of bumblebees because it's harder. They have a hard time if you move them around a lot. For honeybees, if you're for beekeepers, right now in Minnesota, 2 of the varieties that we tend to work with the most are Italian and carniolan. So those are the subspecies of honeybees that we work with, and we have a lot of beekeeping breeders who. So we have a lot of gentle genes here. So a lot of times beginning beekeepers are looking for really gentle genetics and bees that aren't going to be very defensive, and we have those sources here in Minnesota.
Do you have any recommendations for pollinator plants that aren't going to get eaten by deer and rabbits?
Oh man, so that's a good question. I mean, you can look at our list of flowers, but I'm more of a beekeeper than a gardener, so I have a hard time answering that question. I'm all about planting for bees, but I still have a lot more to learn about the specifics.
So you're showing monarch butterflies then?
Oh no, not at all.
No, because how geographically close are you on campus to the monarch people? And the
Oh yeah.
seed field? You used to have the apiary across the street, right?
Yeah, so our
And you moved it.
Yep, we just moved it to the location of the new bee lab. We work a lot. I didn't mention pollinate. I have to narrow my talk. But yeah, good question. Monarchs are super important. Butterflies are super important. And our lab as a whole does work and collaborate a lot with the monarch lab. Yeah, there's no like animosity going on campus. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I was at Menards over the weekend, and I saw bee boxes for sale, and I've seen them in other places as well. Can you talk about those? Are they recommended?
So most of the beekeeping equipment that's sold in kind of garden stores or hardware stores is Langstroth equipment, which is what we tend to use and find to be good equipment, like a good equipment style for our bees here. The harder thing about those sales is that it's really, there's a lot for beginning beekeepers to learn. So it's not, beekeepers aren't normally going to have good success if they just go pick up the equipment at the hardware store and then put some bees into it and see what happens.
I don't mean like for beekeeping.
You're talking about native bee boxes?
Like birdhouses.
Yeah.
It's a little cylinder. So it looked like
Yeah, I know.
something
It's,
that you're just encouraged to put in your garden, and that bees will find them, and
Yeah.
they're a helpful place for bees to hang out. I don't know. So I
Yeah.
don't know if that's valid or not.
So those are for native. So there's different native bee houses. So it's kind of, I was talking about the stem nesting bees earlier, and so basically a lot of the native bee houses are doing is creating those tunnels for bees to go and lay eggs. And so there's a really great resource on our website about them. They're great because they're creating more habitat for native bees, but the issue with them is that they have to be maintained because they can carry diseases and pathogens in them. And so we're still learning more and more about how we can create that habitat without doing harm also. And so on our website, we have a good resource that goes through the different kinds of native bee houses and the materials and kind of the pros and cons of the different kinds.
So that brings up a question that I've thought of. At big box stores, you often find plants that have been treated with neonicotinoids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So neonicotinoids are a systemic pesticide, meaning that they get in all parts of the plant. And so they're in the trunk and the leaves and the pollen, the nectar. And there's different kinds of neonicotinoids, but they can normally either applied as a spray that's sprayed onto the plants, or the seed is treated with neonicotinoids so that the plant or the flower grows with these pesticides in it. And so there's been a lot of work in Minnesota from different groups to reduce the use of neonicotinoids, or at least make consumers more aware of what they're buying. And I know some some nurseries have chosen to either stop selling plants that have been treated with neonicotinoids, or to more clearly label which plants have and haven't been treated with neonicotinoids. But we do know that when I was talking about pesticides having a long-term effect on bees and their immune systems and their overall health, so they're one of the prime examples.
I should mention that neonics, the British have been doing, of course, a lot of work with neonics because they go into the groundwater as well.
Right.
So you end up in the soil.
Yep.
Persistent pollutants, which is sort of, yeah, one of our concerns. They don't go away. You know, a lot of like glyphosates will break down, but neonics, one of those long-term persistent pollutants. So.
Yeah, so it's a good thing for people to be aware of. Mm-hmm.
Friends School plant sale every Mother's Day.
Has a very good selection of plants, and they've been trying very hard to make them neonicotinoid free. So if you go down to the State Fairground Mother's Day.
Cool, thanks.
Are there some sources at the University Extension that could help one evaluate if you had a piece of property you think would be good for raising pollinator plants or monarch attracting plants that could come out and maybe look at a site and say, oh, this would be great for this or that, and help develop a plan for plantings? Or are those kinds of resources available?
So, yeah, I really wish we had staff for that, and we get a lot of people with questions. Right now, most of our resources about what to plant for pollinators is online. The Xerces Society, so it's XERCES, is also a really good resource, but right now we don't have staff that are able to visit people's property to advise on that. But that's a good idea for grant writing.
So it's my recollection that in Shoreview, it's not lawful for us to have beehives in our yard. I question if that's really a risk. I'm just curious of your opinion on beehives in a residential area. And in a similar situation where someone's wanting to keep a falcon, we had someone from the DNR come in and educate Planning Commission and Council with respect to the risk or no risk of doing such things. So, two questions. One, are beehives compatible in a neighborhood? And if they are, would you, or someone in your organization, be willing to help educate a council with respect to a change of ordinances?
Yeah, I meant to look up before coming here about the Shoreview's beekeeping ordinances, and I forgot. So I can't remember the specific laws, but most cities in the Hennepin and Ramsey counties allow beekeeping, and the Minnesota Hobby Beekeepers Association is a great resource if you want someone to go and talk to your city council. There's people from the association that have been doing that for years, and they also have online a model ordinance that defines all the bee and beekeeping terms and legal terminology.
What was the name of the organization?
Minnesota Hobby Beekeepers Association. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can actually speak on that a little bit. I'm the natural resources specialist for the city of Shoreview, and we are actually currently in the process of having an ordinance to allow beekeepers within the city. So you could have 2 hives if you're in less than a 2-acre lot. But it hasn't been officially pushed through, but council is in favor. So we're moving forward.
I can speak sort of tangentially to your question is, I belong to the Shoreview Garden Club, and if you've got more time than just a day, you can join the Shoreview Garden Club and learn a lot about what kind of plants will grow in Shoreview.
Thanks, yeah. Horticultural societies and master gardeners also tend to be great resources for people who want to plant for pollinators. Thanks.
Okay. Well, seeing no more questions, Anna, we do have a gift for you.
Oh, thank
it's
you.
a cutting board. Comes from
Beautiful.
Wood from the Hood, which they take downed trees in the city of Minneapolis, or yeah, that's Minneapolis.
That's awesome. This
and
is
turn them
beautiful.
into cutting boards.
Thank you very much. This
You're
is great.
welcome.
Thank you all.
Let's thank Anna. Well, we have one more presentation this year. That will be the third Wednesday in April, and we'll be talking about how you can prevent food waste. It's kind of a hot topic. You may well have seen a lot of the stories in the news that 40% of food doesn't make it into our stomachs. It gets into the waste stream somewhere along the line before that. So please join us for that presentation in April. Thank you.